Please welcome to the EmTech stage, Amy Nordrum, Executive Editor at MIT Technology Review.
Hello and welcome back. My name is Amy Nordrum and I'm the Executive Editor at MIT Technology Review. We're in the midst of a historic election year, so we're going to kick off this afternoon talking about ways that people can use technology to both help and hinder the democratic process. Later, we'll learn about efforts to authenticate digital content to make clear what was created by a human and what was made using AI. And then we'll hear from an organization that's enlisting everyday people as political influencers on social media. But first, I've really been looking forward to speaking with Nick Clegg, President of Global Affairs for Meta and former Deputy Prime Minister of the UK. Meta is at the center of so many important conversations right now, including election interference and the spread of false information online. And the decisions this company makes about what it allows on its platforms have profound influence. Across Facebook, WhatsApp, Threads, Messenger, and Instagram, 4 billion people use Meta's services. Meta is also investing heavily into AI. And when it comes to generative AI, the company is taking an unconventional approach by making its most powerful model open source. We have much to discuss. Let's get into it. Please welcome Nick Clegg. Nick, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Very good to be here.
Great to have you. Well, to start, so much has been said and written, as you know, about Meta's role in the way that we consume and share information online. So I was curious, from your perspective, what impact do you think Facebook has on shaping public opinion?
I'm not sure if my view is the key thing here. I think the interesting thing is to look at some of the research that is finally being done to answer that very question, because particularly since 2016 and the Russian interference in the US elections at that time, there's obviously been a huge amount of assertion and polemic. It's become a very fraught and heated topic about the relationship between social media and civic discourse and political behavior and voting behavior. But a curious, and of course most especially in the United States, where roughly half the country think that companies like Meta censor too much content, the other half roughly think that not enough content is removed. Hillary Clinton thinks she lost the election because of Facebook. Donald Trump thinks he lost the last election because of Facebook. So everybody is, in a sense, shouting at the same phenomenon from their own particular ideological vantage point. And until relatively recently, there just hadn't been very much research done. And so one of the things that myself and a couple of others at Facebook resolved to do was to use the advent of the 2020 US election with a network of, I think, 7 universities across the United States to give researchers unprecedented access to basically run live, sort of controlled, experiences for actually, in some cases, really sizable numbers of volunteers who would, for instance, during the 2020 election, have only chronological feeds on Facebook. In other words, no algorithmic influence at all. Another very large sort of control group had no capacity to share, so no virality at all. And I think in the most 5 of 14 research papers have been published so far, and the last one was published last week, and that was about around 30,000 volunteers. Around 20,000 of whom just didn't use Facebook at all for 6 weeks, I think it was in the run-up to the election. So anyway, they're completely free to. We have absolutely no say at all, of course, of how the research is done. We just made sure that the data was provided in the right way. And the interesting thing looking at those papers is, and I hope I'm not mischaracterizing a lot of, no doubt, very subtle, nuanced observations. But broadly speaking, and by the way, the data is now going to be made available, so everyone can now examine it themselves, run their own research, to test and verify the assertions arrived at by the researchers. But in the first 5 papers, in effect, the conclusion is that the consequence for people's political attitudes towards candidates, so-called affective polarization, whether they think elections are legitimate or not, is close to zero. which seems to suggest that the link between the use of social media and voter behaviour is perhaps a lot weaker, according to this research, than has often been suggested. It doesn't absolve companies like Meta at all of their role to make sure that elections are played out safely. But I think it is, in my view at least, quite a useful corrective to a somewhat sort of almost techno-deterministic view. I also say this, by the way, as someone who was in politics for 20 years,
Sure.
who spent a lot of time, speaking to hundreds of thousands of voters. Most people's lives they don't just look at something on Facebook, or because I've seen it, therefore I believe it. It's just people are way more complex than that. Their worldviews are shaped through their own experiences, through their friends, their family, their milieu, the communities they live in, the jobs they have, what their kids are doing, what their aspirations are for the future, and so on and so forth. And I think maybe what we're seeing from this research is a useful corrective in that debate since 2016, which perhaps over-ascribed to information technology and influence over how people think politically. Doesn't mean it's not important.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean, by the way, that we shouldn't continue, as we do, to invest billions to try and make sure that things play out as safely as we do on the platforms. But the research suggests the effects seem to be pretty minimal.
Yeah, that all makes sense, and that is very interesting. I do want to ask you a couple tough questions, though, about extremist groups and political violence, since we're talking about elections today. And Facebook's record here is not great. Extremist groups organized on Facebook ahead of the violence in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and the Stop the Steal movement organized on Facebook ahead of the January 6th violence at the U.S. Capitol. And just last month, Wired had a story about militia groups organizing on Facebook ahead of this election cycle. So what steps
which
Facebook... Wired had a story about militia groups organizing on Facebook out of this election cycle. So what steps is Facebook or Meta taking to ensure that Facebook is not being used as a platform for political violence?
Well, I'd have to probably go through each of those, which I won't, not least because I don't have the
Sure.
answers at my fingertips. But I think some of the groups you mentioned are groups that we do ban and do prescribe. Then there's a debate. Do we prescribe them quickly enough? Do we remove them quickly enough? This is a highly adversarial space. You play whack-a-mole candidly. You remove one group. They rename themselves, rebrand themselves, and so on. What we have sought to do, it's imperfect, what we have sought to do since 2016. I mean, I hope it's not sort of me sort of having drunk the Kool-Aid too much in Silicon Valley, but I do think the company, certainly when it comes to elections, is just a utterly different sort of operation compared to 2016. 2016, we didn't have fact checkers. We now have the world's largest network of fact checkers, over 100 of them working in over 60 languages to try and root out and identify misinformation. Back in 2016, Facebook hadn't disabled a single what's called network of coordinated inauthentic behavior, sometimes through domestic actors, but often foreign sort of nefarious bad actors trying to use particularly networks of false accounts to disrupt elections. We've now identified and removed I think over 200 since then. And crucially, we do that through a level of industry-wide cooperation, which just simply didn't exist then. And we apply all of that, including, by the way, AI technology, to try and identify groups, extremist groups, militia groups that we don't want on our platforms. Of course we don't. And then we have a series of policies which we go through to make sure that when we prescribe them, when we remove them, when we disable their ability to run pages on our platforms, that we have done so in a way which is proportionate and so on. Do we catch everybody? No. Do we learn a whole bunch of lessons from researchers? Sorry, I'm pointing to your computer because you were looking at journalists and crucially from other partners in the industry and indeed from governments and election authorities who sometimes notify us of these things. Yes, we do. Do we catch them as quickly as some people want? Some people then also complain the reverse and say you're disabling a network which you're claiming is a militia network and it's nothing of the sort. We try and do so entirely transparently. So now, along with our financial results every 12 weeks, I think we're still unique in Silicon Valley in doing this, we publish in full all of our policies and standards, including dealing with groups like that, and we explain how well we're doing on all the different categories of content or indeed entities that we don't want to see on our platform, whether it's hate speech, whether it's bullying, harassment, whether it's dangerous organizations. And that, by the way, is not just we're not just marking our own homework. That data that we publish every 3 months is audited by EY. And we hope that sort of drives a virtuous cycle of scrutiny, accountability, and pressure on us to do better, where also hopefully we can be compared to our peers as well, so that there's an industry-wide, because, final word, sorry, just on this, but it's very important. We're big, we get that, but what you find in this adversarial space is that what happens on one platform in fact, it always happens on other platforms. There's no point just one entity, one of these companies acting if they don't act in concert, and that's what we've been trying to foster in recent years as well.
Yeah, I want to ask about one of your political advertising policies. Meta is allowing ads that falsely claim the 2020 election was stolen.
Yeah.
And 8 secretaries of state have warned that doing that will undermine trust in elections and increase the risk of political violence. So why are you allowing those ads?
So we're not allowing ads, crucially, where people make that claim about an upcoming election. So you can't run an ad on Facebook. It will be removed if you claim that a forthcoming election. Without sounding too sort of sweeping about it, for history, we're not trying to reinvent history. I say this, by the way, as an ex-politician. I know it's a particularly acute issue here because of what happened in 2020, but I can guarantee you, in elections around the world, losing politicians very, very, very often say, from left and right, that they somehow cheated from not winning. It's an almost consistent pattern across political behaviour if you look across the democratic world. So we just felt it was just not feasible for us to start almost relitigating what people say about past elections. I know when people think about that here, they usually have one example in mind. We're a global platform. 96% of our users are outside the United States. We have to try and develop rules which actually work and make sense globally. It really would not make sense for us to try and relitigate every time someone says from the left that they were beaten by the right unfairly, from the right that they were beaten unfairly from the left. And I think anyone who actually asked themselves how we would do it would quite quickly arrive at the same conclusion. What we're not going to allow, of course, is people to run political ads seeking to actively delegitimize forthcoming elections. That seems wholly inappropriate, in the same way that we will not allow people to run ads to provide people with false information about, or indeed not just ads, organic content as well, misleading people about where to vote, when to vote, and so on. And so that's the reason we've made that distinction. I understand it's controversial amongst some, but I think if you look at the pattern of, behavior of losers in politics, it would be a pretty extraordinary thing to ask a tech company in Silicon Valley to somehow kind of clear that all up after the event has actually occurred.
Well, let's talk about an ongoing election in India right now, the world's largest democracy. And you have an election operations center there that the company has said will identify threats and put mitigations in place in real time. But both the AP and Guardian have reported recently political ads running on Meta's platforms there that contain hate speech against Muslims and language supporting political violence. So why is that still happening?
So, suspecting that you might ask me about this, I asked them about this morning. No, sorry, that's not mean facetiously. It's a really important issue because you're quite right. I think they've just, is it on the 5th round of the 7 rounds of elections? And of course, India is a hugely consequential country, largest democracy in the world. So we attach immense significance to it. And as you said, we have also round the clock, 24 hours, 7 days a week, operations center looking at that. In this instance, it was a NGO who placed these ads, but then didn't run them. So we haven't got access to them. So I just can't answer. They never ran the ads, so they're not on our system. So we've asked the people who then provided the story to was it the Guardian and others. When we get those ads, I'm not saying, by the way, that we're not at fault. We may well be at fault. Our systems are pretty sophisticated, I think, but they're not perfect. But I can't give you a forensic answer because we just don't have the ads, because what they did is they placed the ads, they got them authorized, they claim that it can contain content, and I've got no reason to disbelieve that, but I can't tell you yet whether those ads did break our rules. What I've discovered over the years, I've been at Meta now for just over 5 years, is you have several levels of disagreement. Sometimes people just don't agree with where we've drawn the line. So where you draw the line on hate speech, for instance. Some people say, no, it should be much more expansive. And then other people will say, no, it should be much narrower. And then campaign groups who either take one of those two points of view will then run kind of experiments. And it can either be our failure, in which case, my inclination and certainly my instruction to my teams is we just have to say we got it wrong, we correct it, and we constantly learn. Or it can just be a disagreement about where we've drawn the line. And I just don't know which of those things this entails until we can actually see the ads themselves in question.
Sure. I want to ask you about CrowdTangle. Meta is going to stop supporting CrowdTangle, which is a tool that researchers use to track how information spreads online, particularly during elections. And you're replacing it with the new tool called Meta Content Library. But dozens of researchers and civil rights groups have asked Meta to continue supporting CrowdTangle at least until January, saying that at this particular critical moment, Meta Content Library is not a sufficient alternative, although it might be eventually. So why cut off access to CrowdTangle in August? Why not continue supporting that until January?
So I think the bluntest reason is because it's a degrading tool. It just doesn't give you any complete and accurate insight, which is what it ostensibly is supposed to, into what's going on Facebook. It's not integrated in our systems, and our systems, of course, are evolving all the time. It was built for a wholly different purpose, I think, when it was first bought by Facebook back in 2016, and it only measures a narrow cake slice of a cake slice, which is a particular forms of engagement. It literally doesn't tell you what people are seeing online. So I find it frustrating because we have invested an immense amount of effort and time working with researchers to build this meta content library. We won't be the people who vet who has access to it. That will be done through academic organizations. It's been built, if you like, almost co-designed with the research community, or at least our best efforts to do so. It provides a far more comprehensive and complete view about eyeballs, about what actually people see and experience. And I think 2 or 3 objections have now arisen. One, which I understand, is that there are some folk, and particularly I think journalists, who worry because at the moment they just have free access to CrowdTangle. The access to the meta content library will be a vetted one. It has to be, in order to make sure that the data is properly handled. And that's why it's a sort of almost researcher-first tool. I understand journalists say, well, I'm used to using this tool, that you're taking it away from me. It's always, people never like it when you take something away. But it really is a deficient and incomplete picture, and we're replacing it with something which is far, far more complete. So that's one level of the objection. The other one is a timing one. Well, I honestly, I almost kind of would flip it on its head and say we should probably deprecate it sooner rather than later, because it's just not great to have this almost false picture constantly being perpetuated from a description of what you see on CrowdTangle, which just simply doesn't tell you remotely what is going on Facebook at any time. And then the sort of third one is, of course, and that is that's one I take in a sense the most seriously, is a feeling of, well, we're not sure whether the meta content library will work as well. And on that, I just really hope people give it a go. It's my sincere hope that if we were to have this conversation in 6 months' time, at least some, maybe not all, of the researchers who are now saying, oh, why don't you keep CrowdTangle going, and say, actually, we've got used to this new tool, we've gained access to it, we've learned how to use it, to run it on our own systems, it's fully integrated into Meta's underlying architecture. I really, really hope this transition will lead to at least serious people appreciating this is a serious attempt to give us, for us to, in a sense, give people a much more faithful and comprehensive view of what's going on our apps and services.
I want to ask you about AI-generated content, which we've already seen being used in some political ads and messaging. Back in February, 20 technology companies, including Meta, signed the AI Elections Accord, saying that, among other things, these companies would attach provenance information to make it clear where content came from as it's shared online. But there aren't good ways to do that for audio and video right now, and those are two of the most abused formats for political misinformation. So at Meta, you've asked people to disclose when they use AI to create an audio or video clip that they then upload to a Meta platform. But no bad actor is going to do that. So how do you plan to enforce that policy?
So you're quite right. Things are evolving, and they're evolving very fast. And we're trying as an industry to, and I was at the Munich Security Conference alongside my counterparts from the other big sort of hyperscalers and the other major AI players, where we sort of agreed as an industry that we were going to work together on this. And by the way, I say that with particular emphasis because unlike some other major AI players, take OpenAI for example, we in a sense operate in the sort of full spectrum of this technology. Right from building the infrastructure, training the models, the inference, the incorporation of the models into our products and services, but then crucially, we also distribute the AI-generated content which we ingest onto our services, where users want to share them on Facebook and Instagram, even if they've created an image on Midjourney or DALL-E or whatever. And so, what we're trying to do is to move with the speed that the technology allows for us to do two things. One, to be very clear about the provenance of AI-generated content when it's using our tools. And I was about to say that's the easy bit. It's not quite as easy as it sounds, but it is, in a sense, the easy bit. We can control that. There's a round circular watermark there which says very clearly that it's, that any content that people generate, an image that you generate if you use /imagine on Meta AI, will be clearly watermarked by us. We control that. Where we can use signals, so-called invisible watermarking and so on, signals based on standards like C2PA and so on that are increasingly being used across the industry for images which we ingest from others and that our systems could identify, then we will also apply a visible watermark, and we've started doing that for images as of this. It was May the 20th, so just a few days ago. Here's the problem, and you've just identified it, which is twofold. Firstly, that whole provenance and detection technology is more immature for video and audio, and secondly, bad actors are always going to have an incentive to try and circumvent those. I can't think really of a better approach than what we're just trying to do. We're working across the industry in Partnership for AI, which is a very important umbrella organization where we're developing these not exactly common detection standards, but interoperable ones. We're trying to do so as fast as we can. We made immense progress, actually, pretty well in 6 months on images. I'm confident we can do so on videos and audio, but we're not there yet. It is more immature. And I just think if you have a combination of all the big players doing this, and then, of course, you have both soft law, like the White House executive order that was promulgated by the White House a few months ago, and the voluntary commitments that all of us entered into in July of last year in a meeting at the White House, and you have increasingly hard law like the EU AI Act, which was finally rubber-stamped by EU member states this week, then I just think there'll be such pressure to squeeze out bad actors. But I mean, it's like criminal behavior in the real world. I mean, you have laws, people always try and circumvent laws. That's the kind of nature of rules and norms and standards. You have to try and make them as comprehensive as possible. You have to make sure, as I say, you have the buy-in of the whole industry so that that's not fragmented, that you have regulators and governments on this. And then hopefully, I think you'll see emerging, as with the same velocity that we've seen real progress made on images, you'll see the same thing for video and audio. The only thing I would say, and I say this a little hesitantly because I'm conscious of the fact that it's not consistent with a lot of the kind of almost media expectation that has been set around the role of AI in elections, and because it could change literally from one minute to the next. But the striking thing is, I mean, since the beginning of January, we've had a number of highly consequential elections around the world. Indonesia, the third largest democracy in the world, Taiwan, Bangladesh, now India and elsewhere. Just British Prime Minister has announced today he's going to have one on July the 4th of all dates. So huge amount of elections. The interesting thing is, and we have probably some of the world's most sophisticated teams looking at all of these elections. The interesting thing so far, I stress so far, is not how much, but how little AI-generated content. It is there, it is discernible. It's really not happening on a sort of, at the moment, on a sort of volume or on a systemic level.
How much? Can you give us a sense of how much AI?
Oh, it's really very little at the moment. In terms of what we can detect, I'm not going to put a figure on it because it changes day by day. B, it changes jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Of course, we've seen attempts in the Taiwan election for what I hope are very obvious reasons. There were real, very concerted attempts to interfere in the election. But it really is. It's at the moment, it's a much more manageable amount, and also, if I may, because I do feel sometimes this is sometimes lost in the discussion around AI-generated content. From our point of view, from Meta's point of view, and you should check with other platforms, but I'm assuming they'll say the same thing, our systems and our policies and our tools when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, and so on, are built to be entirely agnostic about the origins. It doesn't matter whether a piece of misinformation about the elections is generated by a robot or a human being. Our fact checkers should still be identifying it, and it'll still be enqueued by our AI systems, interestingly enough, which of course also highlights the fact that AI is a sword as well as a shield in all of this. But our systems are designed to not care about the origin. It's the effect that it has on the user, and it's the content that drives the action, not the genesis of the content. And that's the way we've tried to design our systems and our tools and our policies.
I'm conscious of time, and I do want to give our audience a chance to ask you a question. I'm sure some folks have questions out there. So if you do raise your hand, and our mic runners will bring a mic up to you. Great, yes.
Hi, Mr. Clegg. My name is TJ Preble from Movable Inc. I'm just curious to know if you can comment or will comment on the Missouri Biden lawsuit that's in front of the Supreme Court right now. It alleges a lot of social networks were coordinating with the White House to suppress certain voices.
No, I'm probably not in the best position to sort of start providing a running commentary on something which is under litigation, but I can certainly, not least as the sort of principal executive at Meta responsible for forming and ensuring our policies, our content policies are fairly administered, is that do we get overtures from governments and politicians, pressure groups, vested interests and stakeholders of all persuasions? Yeah, all the time, every minute of every day. Sure. Do we try, and do we have a sort of pretty battle-hardened set of teams who try and nonetheless just stick as closely as possible to the spirit and letter of what our policies are, which are in turn developed on an ongoing basis in consultation with international experts. We now have an independent oversight board, I think the first of its kind in the tech sector, which can overrule our content decisions if they've been found to be wanting, and they can issue binding decisions on us. So we've done everything we can to make sure that our rules are as rational, as transparent, as held to account, not least by regular publication of data, as accountable to a third-party body, precisely to make sure that we're not acting, according to the sort of whims and sort of changing winds of political and ideological sentiment. Because there's just you can't run a platform of our scale and size if you were to do so. So that's absolutely not what we do.
And then one more audience question, I think.
Thank you so much. George Whitfield of the Martin Trust Center for MIT Entrepreneurship. The pace of AI innovation is continuing to accelerate, and Meta is certainly at the leading edge of that. Meanwhile, the speed at which governments make decisions is arguably far slower and in lots of contexts. And I'm especially curious, for your perspective as a former politician, what would you like to see changed in terms of how governments interface, and what can policymakers do to become more agile, to be more collaborative, to shape that future with the companies that are building AI?
So I think I actually think governments are doing not a bad job at trying to keep up with the velocity of change in AI. I mean, of course, you're right. There's always a dissonance between technological change and political decision making. They're never going to be. In fact, you probably don't want them to be entirely simultaneous, but and it wouldn't be logical for them to be so. But I do think, if you consider that many legislatures around the world are right now legislating for a technology, social media, that whose advent, whose emergence is more than a decade and a half ago. So you've had this huge time lag between the emergence of social media and the democratic production of regulation and law to frame that technology. And within that 15-year or 16, 17-year period, of course, there's been this extraordinary pendulum swing of sort of tech euphoria, which met social media in the early days, the days of the Arab Spring and all the rest of it, to sort of almost equally hysterical tech pessimism, some of which I think we've discussed earlier around politics and so on. I think this time, governments, to be fair, are trying to say, no, this time we've got to try and develop our thinking on what the guardrails should be as the technology is being developed, not as an afterthought. So as a sort of coincidence almost to this event, yesterday I participated in a UK Korea government-sponsored summit, AI summit on AI safety, which took place exactly 6 months after the first such summit 6 months ago in the UK, which brought together, Kamala Harris was there for the UK, for the US, Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of Japan, Emmanuel Macron from France, and Scholz from Germany, and so on, and it brought all the major players of industry, and we all spent this time remotely rather than in person, which is what happened 6 months ago. We all, spent a whole morning talking about the kind of things we should be seeking to align on now, not only across industry, which is important, but across industry and government, because no one wants this technology to be anything other than positive for society. Everybody wants to try and anticipate what the downside should be. So I think they're trying to do this methodically and hopefully also do so in a way which is not too fragmented across jurisdictions, which is why I sometimes think for those jurisdictions which have, in a sense, almost sort of tried to legislate first before this, what I'd call almost sort of consultative multilateral effort matures. So the EU, for instance, has already, passed hard law. I mean, I hope that stands the test of time. I think there's a bit of a risk that you almost then move too fast and you then end up being bypassed by the technology. So I do think those are sincere efforts. Final thing I'd say, and I defer to many people in the audience who I suspect will have much more informed views than me on this, it partly depends on what you think this technology is and where it's going. And that candidly, there is just so much disagreement. There are some people who are thinking that this paradigm of large language models is just going to carry on exponentially improving from one generation of models to the next. There's another bunch of very thoughtful people who say, no, large language models are going to start, the curve of progress is going to start flattening out. The latest models are already starting to ingest, synthetic data, sort of breathing their own smoke. How many times can you ingest all the publicly available data that there is in the world? These are very expensive, almost clunky underlying technologies. Are we going to have to look at a completely different paradigm for the future of AI, which is much lighter on data and energy and much nimbler than this? And if you look at the three so-called godfathers of AI, Yoshua Bengio, Yann LeCun, and Jeff Hinton. I mean, Yann is a friend of mine, so I know him best. But they all disagree amongst themselves. So I think that is one of the challenges for the industry, for all of you here, but also for governments, is it's quite difficult to really settle on what the guardrails should be unless you have a clearer consensus on where this technology is going. And that isn't yet entirely clear.
I think we'll have to end it there. Nick, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.